think we'll start. So my name is Gale. I'm an associate professor here at University of Leeds in cardiovascular outcomes research, and we have a group here that uses national and international data sets to look at cardiovascular outcomes. But today, the first LIDA Seminar of 2017 is going to be about big data and how we can, or maybe can't, use that to improve outcomes. So we've got 3 talks today. The main one is going to be at 4 o'clock. It's Professor Kazem Rahimi from Oxford. Prior to that, we've got Marlous Hall, who's a senior epidemiologist, and who's going to talk about how data can potentially save lives with a cardiovascular focus on that, giving an overarching view. And then we're going to go on to the MRC PhD student, who's Bernadette, who's going to narrow down and look at sort of high-resolution information using cardiovascular data sets to see how potentially we can improve outcomes and inform future research. But in terms of Professor Kazem Rahimi, I'm really delighted that he's here. We've known each other for a number of years, on and off, and I see him hopefully as my counterpart, or I'm his counterpart, but you're down in Oxford. And he's there as the senior fellow, the James Martin Senior Fellow in Essential Healthcare at the University of Oxford. He's also an honorary consultant cardiologist, like me, so doing clinical work. He's the deputy director of the George Institute Essential Healthcare Programme, and he's very interested in chronic disease prevention, cardiovascular health services research and outcomes, but how we can use data or data-driven electronic decision support systems to improve our outcomes. So without much more of ado, apart from plugging the next LIDA seminar, which is on the 26th, and that's going to be Big Data and Ethics, the 26th of January, so Big Data and Ethics, and that's across in the Clarendon Wing seminar room. And that will be Baroness Onara O'Neill who will be talking about big data and ethics, so you'll need to register to get into that one. It sounds like it's going to be a good one. So if I can introduce Marlous, who's going to talk about data saves lives, examples from the UK's National Register of Acute Myocardial Infarction.
Okay, so as Chris said, I'm a senior epidemiologist and I work in the Leeds Institute of Cardiovascular and Metabolic Medicine. I'm also currently funded on a Wellcome Trust Institutional Strategic Support Fund, and I'm based up in the Leeds Institute for Data Analytics. So today I'm going to give a few examples of the type of work we do using the UK's National Hashtag Register, and I'll get back to the hashtag Data Saves Lives in just a moment and explain a bit more about that. So just a brief overview of what we do as the cardiovascular epidemiology part of LICAM. We primarily focus on the use of epidemiological techniques to better understand and improve the quality of care and outcomes for patients with cardiovascular disease, when we have a heavy focus on acute myocardial infarction. We use national, clinical, administrative and linked electronic healthcare databases, and my own personal interest is in the use of proper statistics to get the most out of these databases for the good of patients. So we're quite fortunate in the UK that the National Institute of Cardiovascular Outcomes Research, NICOR, hold a range of different cardiovascular related disease registries. One of the ones that we focus our research on primarily is MINAP, the Myocardial Ischemia National Audit Project. And this is the UK's national hashtag register and holds currently around 1 million patients dating back to 2003. It's a large data set in that it's got a lot of rich clinical information on heart attacks with over 100 different clinical and patient demographic variables. We're also at the minute on the brink of receiving some data from NHS Digital, and this is hopefully going to be the national hospital admissions data to be able to look at the longer term outcomes following a heart attack, and the things that we're interested in will be the cardiovascular and non-cardiovascular hospitalizations. So hopefully that data will be forthcoming in the next few months. So the main motivation for this talk actually came out of our Twitter account, which I set up a few months ago. And I was initially a little bit worried when I gave Chris a quick lesson in how Twitter works and gave him the password, and I thought he might have got the wrong idea as he started tweeting about his chickens, but obviously never missing an opportunity to also hashtag data saves lives. He of course also was tweeting a lot about the various bits of research and outputs that we do, and it soon became clear that it's a really good way of increasing the kind of audience for our research. And one of the other good things about our Twitter account is that we've been able to interact a lot with funding bodies. In particular, the British Heart Foundation are quite active on Twitter, and they even highlighted some of our research in their list of achievements for 2016 this year, so that was great to see. So on Twitter, I don't know if everyone uses it or not, but hashtags are used to kind of denote a certain topic area, and you can click on that hashtag and it brings up every other tweet that's used that hashtag as well. And one of the ones that features heavily on our wall is hashtag data saves lives. And some of you may have used this yourselves, or you might have seen it before, but you might not know that this actually came out of a public engagement campaign launched by the Fire Institute in 2015. And the reason that they launched this public engagement campaign is to highlight the positive impact of health informatics research on public health. And it's something that we very much get behind in cardiovascular epidemiology, because we feel that we provide positive impact on patients in the NHS with the big data research that we do. However, not everyone's convinced on this, and there was actually a recent publication which came across again on Twitter in circulation, and it was an editorial talking about the hyper-reality of big data to improve healthcare. So the authors mentioned that substantial challenges exist. There are lots of regulatory and privacy concerns with healthcare data, and primarily they talk about healthcare data being obviously largely observational data, and that there are lots of problems with this, potentially identifying incorrect correlations. There's lots of potential for bias and unmeasured confounding. And they conclude that clearly the conversion of big data hype to reality requires significant work. So our perspective on this is that there are challenges, including access to data, and especially linked data. And even with not linked data, we found this recently ourselves. We're trying to apply to HES data, and the application process has started back in August, and we still haven't got any data, although hopefully that'll be coming soon. And of course, there are a range of statistical challenges, focusing on missing data, selection bias, unmeasured confounding, and on top of this, the processing and storage of the large data sets as well. But I feel that there are plenty of methods to overcome most of these statistical challenges, at least. So I'm not sure that I agree that we really are a long way off turning the hype into reality. So randomized controlled trials remain the gold standard for testing treatment efficacies. But of course, by design, randomized controlled trials are conducted in a very controlled clinical environment, and they have strict inclusion and exclusion criteria. So often a lot of patients who may have a range of different comorbidities or a certain risk categories could be excluded from some of these trials. And this is where observational data can really help out, because it can be used to offer quite high resolution insights into the care and outcomes for large populations on a national or even sometimes international scale in a real world patient clinical setting. And this is obviously, of course, with the caveat that the appropriate and thorough methods are applied to these data sets to overcome some of the challenges I highlighted earlier. Observational data can be used, if analysed appropriately, to inform clinical guidelines, and it could even be used to help with the selection of future clinical trials. For example, with the HES data work, where we may be looking at a range of different outcomes, more than cardiovascular related outcomes and mortality, we might be able to design future trials that take these outcomes into account. And of course, randomized controls are not always practical or feasible, and they certainly can't answer all types of research questions in a practical and affordable manner. So this is where big data really can help out as well. So just a very little bit of background about acute myocardial infarction. They're the leading cause of emergency hospitalisation across Europe, and it's been estimated in the UK that someone is admitted with a heart attack to hospital every 3 minutes. So of course there's a huge health burden of heart attacks across the UK and beyond. However, having said all that, there has been a substantial decline in mortality over recent decades. And we've shown this as part of our publication in JAMA towards the end of last year, and that for particularly the highest risk group, which is the orange line at the top, there's been a sharp decline in mortality rates from 2003 up till 2013. We've also shown that in the lower risk groups, the blue and the grey line there, that mortality is declining as well. But one of the questions that remained was what the reason might be behind these changes in temporal trends in survival. So one of the things that people often say that might be the cause for these reductions in mortality is the changing risk profile of patients over time, and one of the ways that's measured is looking at a clinical risk score of the patients when they first get admitted to hospital. And we could see that for the highest risk category there was a bit of a decline in patient risk over the same time period. We also looked at the same time, there was an increasing trend in some of the pharmacological therapies administered over the same time period, such as aspirin and beta blockers, for example. But more apparent were the increases in the use of invasive coronary strategies, and these are the surgical interventions used for the treatment of acute myocardial infarction, and they increased dramatically over the same time period. So the question remained, which of these changes really accounted for the decline in mortality? So we were able to use a flexible parametric survival modelling approach, which has an advantage over Cox proportional hazards modelling in that it's more flexible in terms of the survival function it plots. It fits to the data, and we fitted those models on approximately 400,000 acute myocardial infarction patients from 2003 to 2013, and we're able to show that without adjusting for anything, the temporal trend in survival, there was an average 3.2% improvement in survival over time. After adjusting for various things such as the baseline clinical risk, the patient characteristics, the comorbidities and the pharmacological therapies, there was still an average annual survival improvement of around 2.5%. So that suggests that survival improvement was there despite adjusting for all of these other factors. And when we then adjusted for an invasive coronary strategy, that sort of excess temporal improvement actually reversed. And the way that we've interpreted this is that the invasive coronary strategy actually counts for the improvements in survival over time. So, as I say, that work was published in JAMA, and we were required to do quite a lot of additional statistics to show how we'd overcome some of the limitations of observational data and some sensitivity analysis. So we did multiple imputation by chain equations to account for potential bias in missing data. We used the advanced survival modelling techniques to more accurately model the patterns for acute myocardial infarction. We quantified all the rate ratios with absolute differences as well. We used an instrumental variable analysis, which is one of the ways of trying to account for some unmeasured confounding. And for that we used regional rates of coronary angiography as a sort of natural randomization of patients. And the idea behind this was, one of the things that reviewers asked for was to see if we could mimic some of the aspects of our data and see if we could get estimates that were similar to some randomized controlled trial data. We also used a mediation analysis to determine the proportion of a temporal trend which was mediated by the pharmacological therapies and the invasive coronary strategies. And we showed that around 90% of the temporal trend was mediated through the invasive coronary strategies, so that again confirms our earlier results from the modelling. So very briefly, one of the other areas where observational data can come in very handy is looking at a range of different guideline care opportunities. So for acute myocardial infarction, there's a range of in-hospital treatments that are delivered, and we're able to look at 400,000 patients again in this case to see whether or not timely and appropriate care was provided to patients following 13 different guideline recommendations. And we showed that patients who missed at least one of those care opportunities had a significantly poorer survival compared to patients who received all of the care opportunities for which they were eligible. We also showed that there was significant variation in end-STEMI care. End-STEMI is one of the particular phenotypes of acute myocardial infarction across the country. So as epidemiologists, we quite often highlight lots of inequalities in care and areas for improvement. And one of the key things that we wanted to do was to make sure that this information gets the right people to actually help provide some change in the NHS. And change in the NHS is all driven by knowledge. So therefore we started developing the Cardiovascular Landscapes platform. And this is an interactive platform being developed in collaboration with the IT guys in LIDA to feed back timely and up-to-date accurate information on cardiovascular care and outcomes. So I'll just show you a very quick video which some of you may have already seen on how this looks. So this platform is still in development at the moment, but the aim is to get it into app format as well as website format to be able to, as I say, feed back all the information that we're finding out in our publications and feed that back to the commissioners and clinicians themselves to hopefully encourage some change in areas where improvement is required. So just to finish up, so big data can provide knowledge on large populations in real world clinical settings compared to randomized controlled trials which are very focused on specific patient populations. It can be used to identify areas for improvement in care and provide the scientific basis for clinicians and commissioners to strive for improvements. And it has the potential to inform clinical practice and maybe also lead to development of new trials. It very much comes with the caveat that if it's in the right hands, in my opinion, because it's very reliant on expert knowledge of the strengths and limitations of data sources. The use of appropriately advanced techniques don't overcome some of the limitations of observational data, and the active dissemination beyond academic publications. And I think all of this comes together very well when you've got a nice interdisciplinary team of clinicians and epidemiologists at all different levels. Finally, just a little bit about our ongoing plans. We hope to move beyond just the single disease-specific registries to develop a greater understanding of how things like multimorbidity impact on care and outcomes, and we hope to do this by linking some of the NICOR disease registries together and looking across lots of different aspects of AMI care. We also hope to use the HES data, like I already said, to look at non-fatal cardiovascular and non-cardiovascular outcomes from AMI. And we've also, very excitedly, recently been funded on a big 5-year programme grant in collaboration with the University of Leicester between Cancer Research UK and the British Heart Foundation to launch the Virtual Cardio-Oncology Research Institute. And that's hoping to link national cardiovascular data and cancer data to look at the interplay between these two very important diseases. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you very much. I'll hand over straight to Bernadette. I think we'll do questions right at the end.
Afternoon, everyone. My name is Dr Bernadette Dondo, and I am a PhD student in the Cardiovascular Epidemiology group. And today I'm going to be presenting one of my research strands from my PhD, which is investigating beta blocker use and mortality in approximately 179,000 hospital survivors of acute myocardial infarction without heart failure, and it's a national cohort study. The authors have no conflicts of interest. Just to give you a background of how this project came about. So beta blockers are the cornerstone of treatment of patients with acute myocardial infarction. However, there's been uncertainty on the efficacy of beta blockers among AMI patients without heart failure in contemporary practice, and many of the data that supports the use of beta blockers in this subgroup of patients predates contemporary medical practice. So we aimed to determine the effectiveness of beta blocker use for reducing mortality in this subgroup of patients in the contemporary medical practice era. So just to give you a description of the data source that we used, the Myocardial Ischemia National Audit Project, which has been described before by the speaker, but I'll just give you a brief summary again. So it's a comprehensive register of hospitalizations for acute coronary syndromes in England and Wales, and information from MINAP is collected from 247 NHS hospitals. And because of the observational nature of this data source, unlike clinical trials, it gave us the opportunity to investigate our aim using a real-life clinical setting data source. And our analytical cohort was derived from MINAP after excluding patients that were hospitalized before 2007, because we're trying to use a good portion of the data that had minimal missingness. And we also excluded patients that had heart failure, patients that had prior use of beta blockers, as well as patients that had missing mortality data, and patients aged above 100. Our analysis was stratified by the AMI phenotypes, which is the ST elevation myocardial infarction and the non-ST elevation myocardial infarction. And we also stratified it by 3 survival time points, which is 30-day survival, 6-month survival, and 1-year survival. So the 2 methods that we employed are survival time inverse probability weighting and instrumental variable analysis. These 2 methods are well known in mitigating bias that is inherent in using observational data, and I'll explain the methods. So survival time probability weighting is a propensity scoring method for time to event data, and it's a 2-step approach which involves a treatment assignment model and a survival model. So the treatment assignment model is a covariant balancing propensity score, whereby the propensity score is the probability of the patient receiving treatment. And we use a logistic regression model whereby the treatment was the outcome, and we included as many of the patient characteristic information that we had in this model to derive the propensity scores, which we then use to get an inverse weighted propensity score of receipt of care that we use to balance the data such that the treatment group and the control group had a similar distribution in the covariates. And this weighted data we then used to fit a parametric survival model depending on our 3 different time points, which is the 30-day survival, 6-month survival, and 1-year survival. And in this model, we also adjusted the patient characteristics just to mitigate some residual confounding. And we also included cardiac rehabilitation only in the survival model because it is a post-treatment variable. Then to move on to the instrumental variable analysis. So instrumental variable analysis is quite popular because it is good at mitigating bias resulting from measured and unmeasured confounding. And it does this by the employment of a variable called an instrument, which will give us opportunity to do the natural randomization process by having 3 characteristics. So the instrumental variable should be highly correlated to the treatment, but not associated with any of the patient characteristics, and should be indirectly linked to the outcome. And most of the most popularly used instrumental variables are regional treatment rates and physician prescribing preferences. And in our case, we chose to use the physician prescribing preferences. And because MyNav does not capture this data, we created a proxy of hospital rates of prescription of the 5 main cardioprotective drugs, which are aspirin, P2Y12 inhibitors, beta blockers, statins, and angiotensin-converting enzyme inhibitors. And because, to the best of our knowledge, we don't know if there's a survival model for instrumental variable analysis, so we employed a Poisson regression model with an offset for the log survival time to just take into account the survival nature of our data. And in this model as well as including the instrumental variable, we also included the patient characteristics. So just to give you a brief description of the systematic differences that were within our cohort. So the beta blocker users tended to be younger, with an average age of 63.3, and mostly male, 71.6%, and most of them were hospitalized with the ST elevation myocardial infarction AMI phenotype with 53.7%. However, the people who did not receive beta blockers tended to have cerebrovascular disease and diabetes, chronic renal failure, and 76.5% of them were in the intermediate to high risk grace risk score. And to move on to the adjusted survival curves, you can see that in the overall AMI group, there were no significant survival differences, as well as even after stratifying according to the AMI phenotype, no survival differences were noted. And moving on to the treatment effect as well, we did not find any statistically significant treatment effect for the use of beta blockers. When we use the propensity score analysis, as well as when we use the instrumental variable analysis, and all the p-values were non-significant, even stratified by the different phenotypes as well as the different survival time points. So in discussion, 95.4% of the patients received beta blockers. The beta blocker users tended to be younger, male, less comorbid, lower risk compared to the non-beta blocker users. And after propensity weighting and confound adjustment, we found that if all the patients in the population had received beta blockers, there would be no significant difference in the average time to death compared if no patients received beta blockers. The strengths of our study are we used data from a large nationwide cohort study, and we used 2 well-known methods when trying to mitigate bias inherent in using observational data. However, our weakness is that we are reliant upon accurate recording of data in MyNav. So in conclusion, among survivors of hospitalization with AMI who did not have heart failure or left ventricular systolic dysfunction as recorded in hospital, the use of beta blockers was not associated with a risk of death at up to 1 year. And this work is currently under review in the Journal of the American College of Cardiology. Thank you for listening.
So what we're going to do is have questions afterwards. But if I could just introduce once again Kazem, who's from Oxford University, so we'll talk about big data, molecular big data, Epidemiology.
snapshots of the screen. The top of this cohort is in a way that we can bring this. We just got out and come back again. Okay, that looks better. Thanks for inviting me to this seminar. It's a great pleasure to be here to talk about big data, its potential on improving cardiovascular health. And the provocative title that Marlous gave me was about the hyper-reality of big data. And let me just at the beginning give my view on this. I think, like as with any other type of fashion, the beauty of big data is in the eye of the beholder. It really depends on which side of the fence you sit. It depends on what you want to see in this. But clearly, as scientists, you have the duty to be critical. It does not help to be over-enthusiastic about this new fashion, and it doesn't help to be too critical and neglect the opportunities that it offers. There's much debate about what big data actually means, and I thought it's probably helpful if I at the beginning just narrow the scope of how I refer to big data during this talk. Obviously, what it entails is a very large data set, and typically, if you look at the data, you can look at it in rows and in columns. So typically, rows are the number of patients, observations, so that has to be large, and columns, the number of variables, that has to be large as well. But this definition could apply to large prospectively collected data sets as well as routinely collected data from clinical administrative data sets that have not been collected initially for the purpose of research. And I'm going to mainly focus on this second type of the data sets. So I'm going to mainly contrast it, in fact, during my talk, to prospectively collected data sets for research purposes. So what are the common use cases of big data? And this applies very much to the classical research data sets. And I tend to think about it in three different ways. We use such data sets first to describe the behavior of individual patients and or the behavior that is really descriptive epidemiology. We can use it to predict an outcome, typically at the level of a patient or a smaller group of patients, and the outcome could be different things. That is the term predictive analytics that is being nowadays used. Or we could use it to make causal inference about, ideally, what we are looking for, modifiable causes of ill health or research utilization, something that helps the decision maker to change something in order to improve outcomes. My view is that all of those are useful. Typically, the descriptive epidemiology, I think, is underappreciated. That is partly has got something to do with the incentives that we have in research. It's very hard to get actually funding for anything that is descriptive only. The predictive analytics, I think this is overrated. There's a lot of discussion about quantified self and predictive analytics and precision medicine. I think we're a bit far away from it, and that is, we're not there yet. And causal inference, that is probably the area that has been mostly debated. And when it comes to big data, that is the area that we get most commonly challenged by people being dismissive of the power of routinely collected data to allow us to make causal inferences in a way that traditional data sets have allowed us to do. I'm just going to go through next few minutes, give you a few examples of the type of work that we have been doing, mainly focusing obviously on cardiovascular research, given that I'm a cardiologist and biased in this field, to highlight some of the key opportunities and added value of using big data to help decision making, and refer to some of those. I will mainly focus during my talk on the last point here, but will provide some examples on the others. So to come to the initial point of power of description, as I said, there is much dismissal of what routine healthcare records can actually do, because for some reason, if you look at the medical literature, some of the most reputable journals, probably I would guess over 80% of the publications are making some sort of a causal inference. It is very hard to find good publications in major journals that are descriptive of nature. And I think this is my plea for people trying to just work on publishing more of the descriptive epidemiology. If you look at it historically, the foundations of modern epidemiology were set by Richard Bloll and Bradford Hill. And when they looked at the common causes of chronic disease, cancer and cardiovascular disease, and it didn't start off by a randomized controlled trial. The ideas, the hypotheses came to a large extent throughout the years, throughout the career of Richard Bloll through descriptive epidemiology, by being able to just look at what is the rate of cancer mortality or cardiovascular mortality over time. How has it changed? How does it differ between one region and another one? And that gives us, if there are huge disparities, that gives us an indication that that doesn't have to be. So there is something not quite right, something that can be changed to make it equal or reduce the rate. And one example that, just give you one example of the type of work that we have been doing using that data set is to look at the uptake of influenza vaccination for patients with heart failure in England. And this does not require any fancy statistics. This is just on the x-axis, the years of people receiving, being affected by heart failure, and on the y-axis, the proportion of people with heart failure who have received influenza vaccination. To just put it in context, I mean, heart failure is a chronic condition, and we all talk about it, that the rate of avoidable hospital admissions is too high. If we could make a minor contribution to that, we could probably help a lot to patients and to the healthcare system. And we have a treatment, a preventive treatment such as influenza vaccination that every guidelines reports we should be using in people with chronic conditions, including people with heart failure. So it's very clear that everyone who has heart failure should receive an annual influenza vaccination. And yet, if you look at the data, these are data from over 100,000 patients tracked over several years. Yes, there has been some uptake and increase, but even in the most recent years, the uptake is more than satisfactory. Probably less than half of the people in a year who have heart failure receiving it. And I think that can be a quite strong motivator to go a bit deeper, saying what are the reasons? Is it real, is it not? Does it differ by certain regions? And so on. So just a few points, and I think electronic health records, big data offer a unique opportunity because they're not selected to be able to look at these questions. And Marlous showed some examples of that earlier. And I think that app, that LIDA Cardiovascular map, I don't know if I've got the name right, that is a great example to just be able to show things that may not be quite right. Now let's get to some of the more correlational type analysis that ultimately lead into making causal inference. One of the obvious advantages of big data is when we've got a large sample size, large N in this case, we can increase precision. And we sometimes forget about it, but to just illustrate the power of increasing precision for analysis, I'm going to just show you an example of looking at association between a very common type of chronic disease, atrial fibrillation, which is the most common dysrhythmia in the Western world, and the risk of a range of vascular outcomes. So if we look at routine healthcare data, this is NHS data from primary care, and we just randomly select 50,000 patients and look at what is the association between atrial fibrillation and people in the future suffering any vascular outcome. This is a sort of a picture that we get. So the size of the square is essentially is proportional to the number of events, and the lines show the confidence intervals. It is actually very hard to see anything in this picture. If you move on from 50,000 to 500,000 patients, you see so the picture starts to become clearer. And when we move on from there to 5 million people, a much better pattern becomes visible. So we are now, with the improved precision, this is just with large N, we are able to observe associations that we couldn't see without such data sets. So, I don't know, there are probably some medical students, maybe some junior doctors in the audience. If you now ask any junior doctor, what do you tell your patient with atrial fibrillation? What do you alert them about? The answer would be, yeah, well, I tell them this is a chronic disease, And there is a risk of people suffering a ischemic stroke, and to mitigate that risk, they should be receiving some sort of blood thinning medication, anticoagulation. That is true. We see that association with stroke. If I get the line right, that is here 1.94, so there's a doubling in risk in people having atrial fibrillation compared to people who don't have atrial fibrillation suffer stroke. But as you can see, this is not the whole story. A range of conditions that atrial fibrillation is associated with, but we don't think about it. And some of them, both in terms of the number of events and some in terms of the hazard ratios that we observe, are actually quite stronger. So this is just to be mindful, and this is one example where we can, with large numbers, identify associations that we couldn't see before. And it's not only that we can estimate more precise. Once we have got a more precise estimate, we can dice it. We can now go into looking at smaller groups of the people and contrast them. Is the association the same between elderly and younger people, between men and women, between people who are obese or not? And to illustrate that example, we looked at, again, two very common conditions and risk of vascular disease. In this case, blood pressure and its association with risk of diabetes. If you look at what we have learned from prospective studies so far and do a meta-analysis, this is a picture that you get. Over 30 studies prospectively have reported the association between elevated blood pressure and risk of diabetes, and when you pool them together, you get together a hazard ratio of 1.77. In other words, for every 20 millimeter mercury higher risk of blood pressure, the risk of diabetes is increased by about 70%. So that is what the literature, up until a couple of years ago at least, was showing. But what it also reveals that the literature is not consistent. So there is a very large heterogeneity of the estimates that those studies have provided, and they all tend to be very small. And if you just look at electronic health records data, you can barely see the confidence interval in this estimate. So you get suddenly a 1.58 association by one single data source based on now 4 million patients and 200,000, 190,000 new events of diabetes that have occurred during follow-up. As I said, this provides an estimate of overall association, but the big data allows you to go beyond that. Now, in the times of personalized medicine, we are not interested in looking at association just at the group level. As I said earlier, we want to look at how does it differ between different type of subgroups of people that are very similar. And here, to just show an example, we looked at the blood pressure effect and its association with diabetes by stratifying people according to the body mass index. Is the association the same if you are more obese or not? Obviously, we know that when people are more obese, they're more likely to develop diabetes. But how does blood pressure affect that association? I'm just going to show a few more of these slides, so it's worth explaining and for you getting familiar with it. This is what we call floating absolute risk diagram. So on the x-axis, you see systolic blood pressure. In this case, we call it usual systolic blood pressure, so it's not just one blood pressure measurement that we have taken from records. This is actually corrected for any measurement bias or regression dilution bias that might be in the data, and that is one of the other beauties of big data. We can actually sample repeated measurements and trying to make reduced measurement error in this. So, but anyway, so this is an indication of individuals' systolic blood pressure at baseline. And on the y-axis, we see the sort of strength of association, hazard ratios, calibrated to the group with the smallest risk, with the lowest risk. And there are sort of four groups here with different body mass index. So the top one are the most obese, the lowest one are the ones who are leaner. And as you can see, in each of those groups, as blood pressure goes up, the risk of people developing diabetes increases. The curve becomes flatter in people who are more obese, suggesting that in these people, blood pressure plays a relatively smaller role, but because the absolute risk higher, it is a major role that it plays. So this is just an illustration of how you can dissect the data when you've got a large sample size and you've got information about individuals. But one of the key questions that always comes up is, are these associations causal? I think it's a good question. And I thought I should give a bit of my perspective on causality. I think it would be a full seminar series on its own to discuss what causality means, which has got different meanings in different disciplines and in different contexts. But if you look at it from the medical perspective, before 1950, the accepted definition of causality really came from Koch's postulates. That was the domain of infectious disease epidemiology. And he had defined 4 criteria, one of which was in order for an association to be causal, the microorganism or the pathogen must be present in all cases of the disease. In other words, it was a deterministic approach. Either you have that, either this is the cause or it is not. When chronic disease epidemiology started to take off from 1950, as I said earlier, pretty much with the work by Bradford Hill and Richard Dole, that definition started to get challenged. So Bradford Hill defined 9 criteria, and he said himself very cautiously that none of them is sufficient on its own and none of them is necessary. And these are sort of the 9 criteria that most students in epidemiology will in one way or another have to learn and give back in the exams. But the approach, the fundamental approach here was that there doesn't have to be a deterministic association for us to accept the causality. It can be a probabilistic approach, and if you relate one to the other one, and it fits with everything else that we know about that disease, including basic science, including other sources of evidence, and we get sort of more confident that this is likely to be causal. So this was a sort of triangulation. I mean, if you look at over time, still that definition is valid in many points. Some of the points that Bradford Hill made have been shown to be less useful and have been challenged over time. But overall, the concept of triangulation, I think, is very much valid. In 1990s, when the evidence-based medicine became more fashionable, and people started defining the hierarchy of evidence, and at the pinnacle of it is randomized trials, and we thought, the ultimate proof of causality is to have a randomized trial. And this is the view pretty much still that prevails among many journal editors and funding bodies. I don't know where we go, but I think in the future we might have alternative models that are data-driven and look at mechanistic learning by making use of big data. But I think what this shows, that when there is not a single accepted definition of causality, when the causality definition itself is subject to context, it is very hard to just prove or disprove that big data is useful for causal association or making causal inference or not. In fact, if any of you will ever submit a paper to JAMA, which is a reputable medical journal, and had a publication in that earlier this year, by submitting a meta-analysis of randomized trials. So these are randomized trials that are widely accepted to show a causal association, and if you do a meta-analysis of those, most people think this is still showing a causal association. The JAMA editors, unlike most other editors, will ask you to change all the wording in your paper at some stage if it is accepted, because in their view, meta-analysis of randomized trials just generates hypotheses. And the way we have conventionally in medicine trying to distinguish between something that we are confident that is causal and something that we are less confident is causal is calling one A causes B, and in the latter saying A is associated with B. So every single meta-analysis that you will see in JAMA will refer to A is associated with B. That is just because a subjective view of the editors. So that shows that how difficult it is to actually define that. But I think there's one common denominator across all of these different type of definitions. And that is, I put it in brackets, it is to entirely, in order to show causality, we need to entirely exclude an alternative explanation for the observation that you're making. And the difficulty is obviously to exclude alternative explanations entirely. Because we can only exclude things that we are aware of, things that we can measure today, other hypotheses that may exist that we want to challenge our findings against. But this is likely to change over time. This is likely to change as new data becomes available. And that applies very much to randomized controlled trials as with any other type of data. The unknown unknowns are very hard to exclude, and that is why they are unknown unknowns. So when I go through the next few examples, I'm going to try to just contrast the findings of EHR with what is widely accepted to be essentially good examples of traditional epidemiology, and to see how good does EHR comes close to that. Because I think that is the only way that we should judge causality in the context of changing environments. And for those who have gone through medical school and have gone through some of the better books, this iconic figure you are likely to come up across. So this is a study done by Sarah Lunton and her team in Oxford a few years ago. And at that time, that was big data. Prospectively collected data, however, meta-analysis of over 1 million individuals that have been included in research data sets to investigate the question of how does blood pressure relate to the risk of people dying of ischemic heart disease and stroke. And this is also a floating absolute risk diagram. And what it showed is there is a log linear relationship between blood pressure and risk of people suffering from ischemic heart disease. In other words, there is no threshold below which the association changes its shape. So the higher the blood pressure, the greater the risk across different age bands that you can see. So this finding, as I said, is now widely accepted through triangulation, has been supported by randomized trials. Still, it's still disputed by some, but it is thought to be a causal association. But now let's move on to some other questions that we might want to investigate in the 21st century. How can we prevent an increasingly common condition such as aortic valve stenosis? For those who are not familiar with it, aortic valve stenosis is a disease that leads to tightening of one of the main valves of the heart and is associated with significant disability and premature mortality. If you open up a medical textbook, clinical guidelines internationally, any of them, in search of what are the preventable causes of aortic valve disease, what do you think you will find? Nothing. It is empty. In the 21st century, we still define aortic valve disease as a degenerative disease. And what we mean really by degenerative disease is that we don't know what has caused it. We think it's a disease of aging. And that pretty much used to be the thinking of what we knew of myocardial infarction. We thought myocardial infarction and stroke are degenerative diseases. But obviously we have learned a lot. We know that they are preventable to a large extent. But this is still the thinking behind aortic valve disease. So in order to find out whether a potentially modifiable risk factor such as blood pressure can explain the risk of aortic valve disease, we need large data sets. So if you contact the same investigators that have reported those nice associations between blood pressure and stroke and say, well, I want to look at that outcome, the answer is, that's a nice question, we don't have the data. Traditional cohort studies have not collected information on these type of outcomes that used to be not very common 20 years ago, and obviously used to be mainly non-fatal. So they focused it traditionally entirely on fatal outcomes. So you're not able to get that answer from any of those traditional studies. So we thought, let's have a look at what we can get from routine NHS data, using data from over 5 million. And these are the data. You will be forgiven to just confuse this figure with what I've shown earlier from the prospective studies collaboration. Absolutely the same association, the same pattern of association is being seen between elevated blood pressure and aortic stenosis. That suddenly shows that the condition, what we believe is largely degenerative. We don't have any tools for preventing it, and all we have is the very expensive tools of valve replacement therapy when patients are affected by or death, becomes suddenly subject to probably further research and treatment. So this analysis is not possible with any research data sets that at least is currently available. By using data from 5 million NHS people, we get suddenly about 50,000 events of aortic valve disease that allows us to look at that association. As I said before, no single source is likely to be proof causation beyond doubt on its own. So, we've got like, traditional epidemiologists apply many tools, including sensitivity analysis, where we replace one exposure with another one outcome with another one, to just see whether we see what we are likely to see, what we expect to see. And in this case, we just looked at another condition, mitral stenosis. This is another valve disease, tightening of another valve, but we know in this case that is in the vast majority of the cases caused by rheumatic heart disease, an infection, autoimmune disease early in life. So we would not expect to see a major association with blood pressure, and this is what we see. This confirms it. There are other ways of looking at it. I mean, there are other ways of challenging that main finding, but no matter how you turn it, today we have not been able to get rid of this association that we see. So the question to you, is it sufficient evidence from EHR to show causality? Is your judgment, and is the judgment of the peer reviewers of the journal. So let me get to another point that I think EHR are particularly powerful to tackle, the issue of reverse causality. What we mean by that in epidemiology is when you have an exposure and outcome and you see an association, sometimes it could be that not the exposure leads to your outcome, it could be the other way around, or it could be some other disease that leads to exposure to change. And so the association is reversed. One example, and you see lots of those examples in the literature, with good explanations why this might be real, but in fact is reverse causality. One example that we wanted to investigate in was the association between blood pressure and risk of dementia, vascular dementia. So it is widely accepted that elevated blood pressure can increase the risk of people suffering from dementia. But what the opinion leaders and the research studies that have looked at the elderly have shown is that among elderly, that association might be the other way around. In other words, there is a plausible explanation that if you are older, your brain requires the blood pressure to perfuse and function properly. So if you lower the blood pressure, you may be causing more harm than benefit. So the cognitive decline may be a reflection of the blood pressure going too down, so therefore we should maintain a relatively high blood pressure in the elderly. We managed to dismiss that idea by, again, using very large data sets from the routinely collected data and stratify the analysis by different age groups. And whilst you can see that in the very old group, the curve becomes flat, suggesting the association becomes weaker, you don't see any downward trend. So certainly there is no evidence that a high blood pressure is essentially high blood pressure is beneficial to patients, elderly patients, in terms of their cognitive function. And how does electronic health records data, big data, allow us to do that? We can now, this is sort of a simple technique. There are more complex techniques to look at that. But one simple technique of trying to just control for reverse causality is to just define a washout period. If your exposure is measured today, you just ignore the outcomes that have been reported the next day, and perhaps, for an outcome like vascular dementia, the outcome that have occurred in the first couple of years. Because it is very unlikely, if blood pressure causes vascular dementia, it is very unlikely that this happens on the next day. You cannot establish that causation. And this graph shows how you can actually show it. If you look at the elderly group, and you don't include that washout period, and you look at the outcomes within the first 2 years, there is a clear negative associations. So you would be misled to conclude that low blood pressure is bad and leads to vascular dementia. But if you then stepwise increase the washout period, go to 4 to 6 years, so you essentially ignore the events of vascular dementia within the first 4 years of reporting or 3 years of reporting, then that negative association disappears. You could not do that with small data sets. You could not do that with traditional cohorts that do not have that information And there are other tools of looking at it. And one other thing that we reported in this study, just look at other data sets and contrast your findings with those to see whether they're broadly consistent. So, looking at treatment effects of drugs and other healthcare interventions typically requires randomized evidence for us to show that. But as Marlous was saying earlier, it's not always possible. And I think there are techniques for us to be able to use alternative methods of evaluating effectiveness. And this is just one example when we used a modified self-controlled case series design. Essentially what it is, you compare the same individual with the same individual, but just different time periods. So an individual acts as his or her own control. And here we looked at the effect of influenza vaccination. I won't go into the details of that. But this showed a clear evidence that the recommendation that people should receive influenza vaccination with heart failure is probably justified. I didn't want to go through these methods. I mean, there are other methods like instrumental variable analysis that you can apply. But I think what is important is by using electronic health records data, you can not only apply those methods to the data, it allows you to do that triangulation that is necessary. So here, we were able to look at outcomes of cancer. So if there is obviously bias, you would see the same bias if you look at a different outcome. But yet, the association is flat if you look at cancer hospitalization. That is, and if you look at the same individuals and compare them not only with the year that they received vaccination with the year when they didn't receive vaccination, but you look at in 2 years when no vaccination was given, again, the association is flat. So that supports that, that association observed is unlikely to be entirely, at least, due to uncontrolled compounding. So what I've shown so far is really traditional epidemiology applied to a different type of data sets that has got its own merit and has got its own challenges. But how can we go beyond that? One of the strengths and limitations of big EHR data is that it's just much more complex than the type of data that we as epidemiologists use. So anyone who has to work with things like CPRD primary care records knows how much time they have to invest to understand the data before they can actually get into this. And that situation is likely to become more complex as we get data from different sources, and we and many other groups are trying to link those data to get a better picture. Each of those data sets have got typically their own software that are run by, their own language that are running by. And what we have been doing so far, most groups take a traditional approach that is very much expert-driven. So for those studies that I've shown, the way it works is saying, okay, I define as a researcher, I've got content knowledge and expertise. I define a research question, might be a hypothesis or anything else. And then I define what are the sort of variables and outcomes that I'm interested in. That might be my exposure, my confounding variables, or anything else. Then I go to the data set and extract those features from the data sets, and I then run my analysis on it. As I've shown, this can be actually very useful and can answer many questions. But this is really looking at part of the picture. This is ignoring the vast amount of information that those data sets include. Perhaps a better way of looking at it would be, instead of reducing complexity by an expert at the outset, is just embracing the whole complexity and use different techniques to be able to analyze the data. And this is subject to a new program that we are starting in Oxford called Deep Medicine, where the purpose here is to use, to borrow really techniques from machine learning, engineering, deep learning, to process that data in a way that allows us to make inferences at the same time was tackling some of the questions that we have been really ignoring, such as multimorbidity, smaller data sets, and that selective approach are unable to investigate. So this is a program where 4 departments are coming together, very interdisciplinary. That's computer vision, engineering, neurosciences, epidemiology, statistics, and clinical, and is about to start in April. So one of the initial type of work that we will be doing is that aspect of automated dimensionality reduction. And to just give you an idea how it could work is, you could look at electronic health records in a way that you have a patient with some static data, which could be the age and demographic, that never changes. And you've got, obviously, time-stamped events that could be measurements that the patient has, outcome that they have, physician visits that they might have. And you could apply techniques where that data set is being shrunk automatically through analytical techniques of deep learning, where the machine essentially learns the correlation, the hierarchical correlation between the different data points that exist in the data, and represent that patient with few less features that might be available. And this is just the initial stage of processing the data, and you could apply it in different ways. You could use it as a simple data preparation to do the standard techniques that we use in statistics and epidemiology, let's say Cox proportional hazards model, or you could use it for data imputation, you could use it for risk prediction, or any clustering of, for instance, multimorbidity that you might be interested in. So now let me move on to give you some ideas about the risk prediction. As I said before, I think the domain of predictive analytics seems to receive quite a lot of media attention, and if you follow the Twitter accounts of some of the big data opinion leaders, that seems to come on and on, that we seem to be on the verge of being able to predict which outcome is someone is likely to suffer, and then be able to tailor the treatment towards that patient. I think, as I said earlier, we are far away from it because we don't have the data. I mean, if you had all the information about an individual, then obviously that becomes a different thing. But you can imagine that knowing exactly what happens to an individual, their behavior outside of the healthcare system, in the private life, whether this is credit card and so on, linking all it together, it is quite far enough. And then the other challenge that we are facing is at the user's end. If you look at as an editor of a journal, you're likely to see quite a number of papers that claim in one way or another have somewhat improved the predictive ability of the previous model. But one of the main questions that I ask when I see these papers is, how is it actually going to improve outcome? It is quite common that people trying to just tweak a bit on the edges and improve slightly this, whether this is the C-statistics or whatever method they use to compare their model. But there is no user. There is no use case for those models to be used. Even the simplest model are not widely used in clinical practice. And I think what we need to do is, in order to make them more useful, as we obviously work on to increase the predictive ability of those models, is to come up with tools, whether it is a software, that allows that risk prediction to be automatically incorporated into the routine decision-making of whether these are patients or physicians. And this is just one example, when you could imagine where you collect all the information that we know about the evidence that we have about efficacy of a treatment, different types of treatment that might be applicable to a patient. You rank them according to the strength of evidence that is acceptable. And in the next level, you could even use it to capture a person's preference. So if a person does not want to have a surgery at all, or they don't want to take a pill, you could incorporate it into that decision-making model, and trying to then give advice about what is it that appropriate for that patient. So, and I think that is probably the only way where shared decision-making works. Because there's a lot of talk about using data for informing decision and shared decision-making. And I always wonder, how is it possible without having that information quantitatively that allows people to understand what are the consequences of the different decisions that they have to take. This would allow you to do that. This would allow to incorporate it for people to be able to. I mean, this is just some ideas and requires quite a lot of work, as you can imagine, to be incorporated. And then the next thing is obviously to incorporate that decision-making real time, places where it matters. And this is one project that we have when patients manage their own condition, patients with heart failure and their comorbidities, where we get instantaneous data from them. And in such a model, you could incorporate those risk prediction models, and you have directly accessible the information of the individual, so you could individualize that according to patients' features, and at the same time capture the preferences for any treatment that they might have with educational material that allows them to know it. And if you go a bit more even futuristic, you could have a model where you know exactly about what is going on. Augmented reality is a term that is being used, where you could incorporate that information about the patients by just seeing the patient. You know exactly what is the condition, what are the potential preferences, you have the risk of an individual, and can use it. The alternative model of publishing papers on risk prediction models that tell us the C-statistic is improved from 0.79 to 8.2, I don't think will make any difference whatsoever to individual management. It has to be somehow become part of the decision-making in a daily routine. So this is coming to an end. I mean, I think I've shown some examples about how one could use electronic health records to look at variation in care, to inform about time trends that become hypotheses for investigating further. How one could use the data, ultimately, if you've got access to all the data sets, to improve prediction. But I've also shown that at least in the current realm of what we believe to be a concept of causality, how using data routinely collected by patients and physicians, not for the purpose of the research, gets very close to what very expensive, time-consuming research can produce. But all of that requires collaboration across the board. I mean, the simple model that a doctor or a statistician, epidemiologist answer the question doesn't work. So this is really bringing data scientists, computer scientists together with statisticians, clinicians, and software engineers together for us to be able to advance. And this requires also institutional collaboration. We didn't talk about it, but I'm sure you're all aware of the challenges of accessing the data at a national, international, and even local level to be able to make use of it. So thank you very much for your attention, and happy to take any questions that you may have.
Absolutely superb talk there. We're going to open the floor to questions, please. I think I'm going to start with the first question, because so you were trying to convince me about causal inference then. I'm still a little bit, maybe I'm a bit of a Luddite, so that I'm not quite as keen on the causal inference. Maybe that's my training and background. But and I'm still a bit traditional in terms of randomized controlled trials. So one of the things you did mention was these risk prediction models, where we're running C-statistics, and we've got the next one, the publication, C-statistics is slightly better. And we can all develop these risk prediction models, but actually putting them into practice and changing practice is another thing. So how would you go about changing practice using sort of risk prediction models?
Yeah, I think there are two entire approaches. I mean, I think risk prediction does not depend obviously on causality, and that is one of the beauties, in fact, of big EHR data. I'm not interested to know whether someone's wealth is actually the cause of that patient suffering an event, but if I know that, well, for someone having red shoes or, I don't know, something else, can accurately predict what is happening, I'm perfectly happy with it. So I can know, based on someone's certain features, certain things are more likely to happen or not. And this is, there should be no debate about it, that electronic health records with the large variable data sets that they have, ultimately they should be able to get better prediction of outcomes. As I said, putting causality for a moment aside is a different question. But how do you get actually those models into practice? As I said, I think the question is it requires a sort of a systems approach. What is the way that clinicians currently make decisions, and how can that tool of risk stratification be incorporated into current models of health delivery or alternative models of health delivery for stratification? There are research studies that have shown what are the physicians' perception about some of the oldest risk prediction models, such as Cunningham studies, and a lot of them don't find it particularly useful. And if you compare different models, they're saying, they're coming with different results, and they think it doesn't apply to my patients. So I think it just has to be an IT solution that incorporates into the pathway of the patients. But I don't see any way of traditional academic approach of here's a paper, you have read it, use it.
I just wonder whether, just thinking about the NHS, so you're not on the hospital, both hospital-based consultants, and we know that we stand at the end of the bed and make a risk prediction, don't we? Which is slightly different from primary care, where you're sat in front of a computer at a desk with a patient. And I wonder whether risk prediction algorithms can be put then through primary care, big data sets to help them.
No, I mean, you're right. I mean, one should make a distinction. First to say that we have actually incorporated some of those risk prediction models in other healthcare settings into the computer system of the GPs, and that works well. I mean, the models are not perfect, but as you see the patient, as information is gathered, you see automatically what is the cardiovascular risk, and you can use it as a platform for communicating risk. Now, changing the behavior for hospital physicians is, I think, more challenging. You've probably spoken to some colleagues as well, but a few years ago, I remember I spoke to one of my senior colleagues in Oxford and said, this is an exciting project that we want to work on to come to a risk prediction model that allows us to do X and Y. And he sort of looked at me and said, he just, I think he was trying to be polite, saying, I think this can be useful for some of the junior doctors, but I think I can, from the head, guess what the risk of this patient is better than any of your models. I mean, research says otherwise, but it is not only the fact that we are working at the bedside. It is cultural problem that exists in clinical medicine, particularly among consultants who believe they know it better. And I think part of the research could be to show that they're not better, but it's hard.
Yeah, well, as I said, been shown before when people run analyses, what do you think is the outcome? Asking the hospital-based consultant. But I think there's an opportunity, as you're saying, and you may well have done some of this in terms of primary care and risk prediction models, but then to use that big data set platform to do a trial, to test whether the risk prediction model is actually better or not.
And I think there is actually one trial that at least I'm aware of in Australia, funded by Servier, I think, a pharmaceutical company, that tries to precisely do that, which is relevant probably to your work in people admitted with acute coronary syndrome, an approach where a computerized risk prediction model, I don't know if it's paper-based or computerized model, that suggests who should receive invasive treatment and so on, is compared with the conventional approach. Typically those complex intervention trials have got really a number of challenges. That starts off by typically being underfunded compared with the drug trials. And then you've got obviously the institutional barriers, the complexities of the intervention, and when you select a population for a trial, then you lose generalizability and also the issues. But you're absolutely right. I mean, we need more research in that area.
So yeah, lots and lots of questions.
one of the challenges for surgeons is trying to predict outcomes in operating on people who are very old, in their 80s and early 90s. So I'm just wondering whether you've had any thoughts about that and potentially about the life length of the sort of primary care approach, because often it's what's been happening in the recent past that can potentially alter the way in which you offer an intervention, which is getting prolonged, expensive, and then potentially then think about the immediate post-operative treatment, the first 24 hours, because often the diet is being set, and then the question is whether you continue prolonged therapies, which are very expensive for weeks, if not months thereafter.
Yeah, I think generally risk prediction in the elderly or the very elderly is very interesting and has been very challenging. It's even more challenging for the surgical setting because we're not only interested in risk of death. A lot of surgeons and patients, when they make decisions about whether they should undergo a surgery or not, they want to have information about lots of outcomes. What is the bleeding risk? What is the duration of them staying in hospital or ITU, as in addition to any harder clinical endpoints. And currently the problem is that many of those commonly called softer endpoints, routinely collected data don't have them. So yes, you may have some loader sort of predictive variables that are about that individual available, but if you can't link it to those things that the patient or the surgeon is interested in, it's very hard to come up with. Technically, it is possible. I mean, if you have that data, what I've shown here, and the new ways of reducing dimensions and extracting to be able to predict short-term outcomes is possible, but it just comes down to have you actually measured it. What is the length of hospital stay for each individual, what type of bleeding risk, and so on, and to be able to link it to that data. It is tough.
I think certainly for the very elderly, death is not a major issue.
Yeah, exactly.
Operation. What bothers them the most is, if you do something to me, will I get home?
Yeah.
So I assume that social care collects data that could potentially inform you to say that, yes, we can do something to you, and there's an 80% chance you'll get home with one or two healthcare providers.
Yeah.
Is that acceptable to you?
Yeah.
Whereas if you said there's a 90% chance you're going to go to a nursing home and you need full-time care, a lot of people will think about that very seriously.
Yeah. I think that is a great case for linking that data, social care.
So I wonder if we should sometimes turn things on a head. So at the moment we've been talking about explanatory factors to look at positive outcomes, right? We've brought on the elderly, and I'm just blending that into Bernadette's work. I wonder if we're approaching an era now where we should be thinking about reducing care to optimize care. And I think data could help us with that, especially in the sort of elderly, frail era. So challenging.
I think it's a big question. I mean, if you look at the NICE guidance on multimorbidity that just published, I think a couple of months ago, highlights that as research need. The term descaling treatment or interventions, I personally think is very exciting to embark on. And in fact, we are interested in it, and we have got a multimorbidity program with a couple of people working on it. What I still don't personally understand, and I think that is where the descriptive epidemiology first has to come in, is what do we know about the rate of different treatments among elderly? Who are the people who are using a lot? Who are the people who are using a few? To get a sense of what is the need. Where are the things that we could potentially invest in? And that is relatively straightforward, one could think, but given the number of, if you just think multimorbidity, 3-4 conditions, typically people may be on 20 different drugs, linking to the conditions and the outcomes, it just becomes actually quite a project just describing it. I don't think there is great work that has been going on. But once we have done that, the next question is what sort of indication you get from observational data where it might make sense or not, and ultimately it might be, as NICE suggests, should be trials that look at different outcomes and different populations and take certain treatment off and compare the outcomes. This is obviously very time consuming, but I think as a principle it is very interesting, and there are not many experimental studies, at least I've seen, that have been bold enough to look at it at scale.
You mentioned that the data at the moment, especially in primary care, is easily collected data.
Yeah.
It was not set out that you were going to conduct research on it. Do you think there should be a message sent out to all the clinicians that from now on, just be aware that we will use the data for research? So do you think it will improve the output from the research?
Yeah, I think they're aware of, in that primary care data set that we're using at least, they're aware that the data will be used in an anonymized fashion for research. To which extent that affects the behavior, I don't know. I mean, I don't know the literature well enough. I don't know if some other people might be answering that question. Certainly, I mean, there are multiple people entering that data into the database. It is fair to say that the entries are likely to be more prone to random error and missingness. We didn't have to go into details of it, but in a lot of the cases, it either doesn't matter that much, or you can find a way of mitigating its impact on the questions that you want to investigate. So, yeah, yes, in the ideal world, you want to have all the information, people being aware of it and collecting in the right way. But as researchers, we have to deal with whatever we get, really.
Just for the medical students, I just wonder if you could give us a very brief review of how you got into this area from your clinical training, and how you developed these extraordinary skills that complement what you've done as a clinician. I'm sure some of the younger folk here will be thinking, wow, I'd really like to do something like
Yeah.
that. And I wonder how did you add to your basic clinical training to be
Yeah.
able to take on this sort of challenge?
I mean, that's very kind of you, Alex. I think it comes down to being curious. So I think some medical students, like in any other profession, are quite clear when they go to medical school what is it that they actually want to do in the future. I was not one of those. I could have ended up doing really anything, from psychiatry, GP, cardiology. It was just a coincidence that I ended up doing cardiovascular disease. What was always my motivation, like many of the other physicians being altruistic, you just want to help the patients. I trained in Germany and ended up working in one of the largest, probably still the largest cardiovascular intervention center in Europe. And I got a bit frustrated by the overuse of the toys that we have as cardiologists access to. It did not make sense to me to just literally anyone that could not run away to drag that patient to the cath lab to just find out their coronaries are normal, or to just an intervention, coronary intervention on a patient where the science had taught us that actually didn't make any difference. So I got exposed in different type of research at that time, and I thought it might be a problem that is unique to the German healthcare system. So I thought, after having done some electives in the United States for over half a year, and I thought, let's get again to a different healthcare system, and I did some medical training in London, leaving cardiology out and getting exposed to general medicine, which was fun. But I saw the same problems were here. I mean, that was a time where the investment into the NHS was increasing from, at that time, I think 7% of the GDP going gradually to 12%. We're getting very close to what Germany spends, and despite the fact that still I think cardiology is very critical about doing that sort of intervention, still that overuse, that sometimes misuse of the technologies was available. So, I mean, I thought, how can you make the greatest impact? And I didn't see that I would make a great contribution by becoming yet another cardiologist on the ward and doing interventions in and out. So, but I realized that the things that we are taught at medical school are not sufficient to be able to answer those, questions that are of relevance to public health. And so I did essentially sort of in parallel to the other work that I was doing in MSc in public health and health services research, to get exposed to some of the tools and essentially learn by doing some of those questions. So a lot of it comes, being surrounded by a lot of smart people that teach me about these things, just thinking about it. And having in mind not the publication in the next journal, not the title that may get you to X and Y, but where, how can you actually affect and improve outcomes? And I genuinely believe that physicians are probably one piece of the puzzle, but you do need to work with people who look at the problem from different angles and bring different skills on board to be able to answer the big questions. So that is how I got probably by accident into this. I mean, I probably should have said, somewhere halfway through my career, I started working on large cardiovascular trials, working with clinical trial service unit in Oxford with Rory Collins and so on staffing trials. But again, I mean, I got disillusioned. I didn't see that we need yet another pill of cholesterol lowering where, as your study others has shown, the uptake, the issues that we see on a daily are, at least for cardiovascular medicine, a big issue. I mean, it does not apply uniquely to all conditions, to all specialties. If I speak to my colleagues in nephrology, you see that there's a lack of evidence for any decision that they make. I think we need a lot of evidence in that area. But in cardiology, I think the problems are quite obvious. A bigger source of healthcare utilization and area where we could potentially make an impact. I mean,
The LIDA Seminar series, thank you very much
thank you.
for presenting this talk.